Hi, all. Welcome to Intentional Action for Racial Justice. This is the second part of our three-part series on dismantling systemic racism here at Synergos. Let's go over our agenda. So we have a very special panel prepared today and opportunities for Q&A from the audience, which we're very much looking forward to. And then we'll move into closing words. And so to get us started, I wanted to introduce my colleague from Synergos, the Global Leads Program Director, Tarlin Saye. Tarlin, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Laura, and welcome everyone. And thank you for joining us today for this part 2 in our Dismantling Systemic Racism series, a series in which we at Synergos intend to host multiple spaces for our network, both current and new, to enter and connect with others who wish to say more and do more on racial equity. So my name is Tarlin Saye, and as Laura said, I'm a global programs lead here at Synergos. I see many familiar faces from our first session on racial healing with Dr. Christopher held last week. Welcome back, and thank you for continuing this journey with us. Your commitment to this space and these discussions is it's inspiring. So the objective for today's meeting is to hear from your peers, our wonderful panel joining us here today. We have Lauren Embry, who is the philanthropic visionary of the Embry Family Foundation, a foundation with multiple passion points, including racial and gender equity, human rights awareness, arts for social change, and so much more. She's also a member of Synergos' Global Philanthropist Circle. Holly Lee is also joining us, and she's the co-director of the Donors of Color Network, which launched in March of 2019. And is the first ever cross-racial community of donors of color and movement leaders committed to building the collective power of people of color to achieve racial equity. And we have Amy Brakeman, also a member of our Global Philanthropist Circle and president of the Umsizi Fund, an organization that has worked on the African continent for the last 15 years, providing financial and professional development resources to support African youth, managers, and senior leaders who can deliver goods and services to improve the lives of other Africans. Ladies, I welcome you and thank you all for being here today to share your journey on how you entered the arena of racial equity and social justice, how you've built and sustained relationships, and to share some insights on where others can begin applying a racial justice lens to philanthropic efforts or to sustain themselves on the journey, because we all know this path is not an easy one. It takes energy, commitment, and bravery to step into this work. And we on the panel, we invite all of you here to be brave with us in this space today, to come with your full selves, your ideas, your fears, and your questions, to ask these wonderful women here with us today to please share a bit more with us about the work that you do for racial equity and social justice, and why you found it essential to get involved in this work. You know, why start or resource a current movement that combats racism? And Lauren, if I could be so bold as to start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tarlin, and everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with you today. Thank you, Synergos and the GPC. It's an honor to be a part. I have a very personal seed for my reasons. I grew up in Texas. I grew up in the South, in the Southern culture, and there was a Black woman that took care of me from the age of 3 months old, which I call her the keeper of the soul. She was the keeper of the soul of the house. And without her, my life would have been different, I do feel. She brought awareness, she brought love unconditionally, she brought passion, caring into my life. And my parents were bold during those days and allowed me and actually sent me into her neighborhood to be with her friends, the children that lived there, her people. And so I had many experiences growing up of being in a Black only neighborhood in this Southern culture. I grew up, I was born at the end of the 50s, so 1958. So all this really happened in the 60s in the state of Texas. So I looked at my parents as being bold and forward moving in their thinking at that time. So the seeds for racial equity and justice have always been there because of my love and my caring for her, and also because of the disparities that I witnessed that of course I did not understand growing up in a wealthy, privileged culture, but as I learned throughout life. So hearken forward to my 20s, I had an experience that I don't have time to get into now that I held and didn't really understand the consequences of what I was doing and saying. I felt like I was being a very forthright white person at that point in time. So that would have been in the 80s in moving forward in the efforts of racial equity and justice. Fast forward again another 20 years, when I'm now the leader of our family's foundation. And in my mind, I was thinking about, at this point in time, I was thinking about the belief systems, the patterns that we hold inside our body that move our behaviors, shall we say, or inform our behaviors that we're not conscious of. Very shortly after that, I went in probably 2008, 2009 to a white privilege workshop being put on by Race Forward in conjunction with the Women's Donors Network. And I had a revelatory time and experience, an aha moment at that time, because I shared this story, this experience of 20 years ago with one of the facilitators. And what I did not understand for 20 years, she understood in 1 minute. And it was like, and she told me the answer, and it was like I was punched in the middle of my chest. Like, how could I be so ignorant? How could I have never understood that the reason for this interaction was because in the day someone could have been lynched with what I was asking them to do. So the seeds for racial equity and racial justice have always been a part of our focus at the foundation, but it came even more so during that time period. A few years after that, we started an initiative in our community. We've been place-based. We've been very place-based we wanted to really dig into our community, our people, listen to their stories, hear what they have to say, and help them inform us as to what we need to do. We started a forum called Dallas Faces Race, in which we did just that. And we had a very big focus on the arts, in particular, arts organizations with women of color-led arts organizations. We had roundtables, we had Jefferson table discussions where we heard so much about healing and the necessity for healing. So while we were also, we heard it over and over and over again. So while we were also looking at our on-the-ground funding to organizers, small organizations of color, women-led arts organizations, and other, we knew that there was a necessity for healing in this space, healing the trauma, the immense trauma that had happened. And at that point in time, close to that point in time, when we also brought in a conference, the Race Forward's conference that happens every 2 years called Facing Race. We organized with another family foundation and got it to come to Dallas. And it was the first time that it has ever been in the South. And it was extremely successful, in point also because we had also been doing engagement work for 2 years prior to the conference coming to Dallas. Then we hearkened forth to around 2016, and that was the shooting where the police officers were killed at the Black Lives Matter rally in Dallas, Texas. We immediately I got in contact with Dr. Gail Christopher very shortly after that, and we set up a time for her to come into our city because we knew they were developing at that point in time the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation curricula and work through the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. She came into our community. We were able to gather community foundations, smaller family foundations, and larger foundations within our community to help support this work, but in particular and first to learn about this work and to begin that exploration together. So here we are now, our main focus outside of, as I said, supporting the organizers, supporting the smaller organizations of color and arts-led, et cetera. We are deeply engaged in building capacity support for the truth and racial healing and transformation work of course, which we are not the main voices. Someone in our foundation is on the steering committee, but it is the Black, Indigenous, and people of color that are at the forefront of making these decisions. And so we've also been able through the lifeline and evolution of this work to see how that has transformed from them wanting us, actually asking us, what are we going to do next? To us kind of saying, I don't know, what are we doing next? Let's discover this together, to now being Black, Indigenous, and people of color fully led, with us being more in a support position and definitely a wielding of power and a sharing of power position.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Lauren. That's a pretty incredible story. And I love that you talked about seeds, and I would love to hear the seeds of where, Holly, your journey started and getting into Donors of Color Network. If you'd like to share with us, please.
Thank you, Tarlin, and thank you, Katie, for inviting me to represent Donors of Color here at this conversation, and the whole Synergos team. It's a pleasure and an honor to share this Zoom room stage with Amy and Lauren. And Lauren, I've heard you share that story a few times in the past, and it's just moving, and it moves me every time. And I want to thank you for sharing it again, and I get to hear it again. Thank you for that. And I also wanted to say hi to a few of the Donors of Color people in the room. I see you, and I appreciate you, and thank you for being here to participate. So, you know, for those of us who are based in the US right now, racism, and let me just call it out, white supremacy, is literally slapping us all in the face right now. We're dealing with COVID, and the uprisings that are happening all across the country. This is a historic moment. COVID and these uprisings are really laying bare the systemic racism, class inequality, and xenophobia that are just so baked into many of our country's histories and systems. At the same time, there are huge movements for change happening around the country that are incredibly inspiring and have got to give us hope. Many of these movements are being led by people, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. Many of them are being led by women of color, Black women in particular, by young people, by queer friends and brothers and sisters and trans folks. And we have to take some optimism in what's happening around us in response to what we're seeing. At the same time, we've noticed at Donors of Color Network that a critical piece of the funding infrastructure has been missing, and that's individual donors of color. These are folks with lived experience that matches some of the lived experience of the people who are demonstrating and the people who are organizing for change. It's part of our argument that the lived experience of the folks who are joining our network is going to make their philanthropy different. It's not rocket science to assume that or think that. I can get into lots more details about who our community is, but just suffice it to say that over 80% of the folks in our cross-race community are wealth earners and wealth builders themselves. They grew up poor, working class, middle class, in some cases dirt poor. Every single person has experienced racism, discrimination, or bias based on the color of their skin, their religion, their country of origin, their accent, who they are. So that is these lived experiences are going to impact and affect the way the folks who are coming to our network are thinking about giving their money away. We know that individual donors fund for the long haul. You know, of course we can be whimsical too, but we don't undergo 5-year strategic plans, you know, every 3, 5, 7 years like a lot of foundations do. And we put organizations into our will. So this is a really important piece of the funding infrastructure, the movement funding infrastructure that we think has been missing. So the Donors of Color Network is the first ever network in our country to bring together donors of color with means in community that is cross-race, aligned around a set of values that prioritizes the leadership and concerns of communities of color in America. These are the folks who are coming to our network are bringing resources, their hearts, their minds, their networks, their money. One of our friends likes to call it the 5 T's: time, talent, treasure, testimony, and ties, right? So these are folks who are bringing all of these things to bear at a moment in time where our country needs this more than ever. And in many cases, the folks who are coming to our table have been uninvited, unincluded, unengaged at the philanthropic tables and decision-making tables that have existed for a long time in our country. So this is a moment, I think, that really requires a community like the Donors of Color Network, and we're delighted and honored, honestly, to be able to be the table, the party, to build the party that we want to be at, to bring all of these resources to bear at a moment in our country's history when we need it more than ever. I'll stop there. Thanks, Tarlin.
Thank you, Holly, very, very much. I was excited when I first heard about the Donors of Color Network, because again, I had never heard of a group like that before. So hearing a little bit more about how it got started, why it got started, its purpose is very, very interesting. And I definitely plan to ask you more. But at the moment, I'd love to give the floor to Amy so she can let us know where her seed started and the work that she's been doing and why she felt that work was important.
That's a great segue, because I was not activated on investing in racial justice in the US. It was really on the back burner for me, and I would sort of turn a blind eye to it, say, oh, I have, my plate is really full with the economic inclusion work I'm doing on the African continent. And it had been kind of piquing racial justice and how systematic it is in our culture and how I benefited from this racist system. It's kind of peaked out at me over time, and then I sort of get back to what I'm doing. I could no longer do that anymore when I started seeing the health data back in April about the health injustice that is all tied together to all of the injustices. That's when I really dove in and said, okay, now's the time. I mean, I had started learning about how systematic and even that it was built into policies at a national level in our country. I had started learning about that through impact investing circles where they talk about the racial wealth gap, and through having the great privilege to having gone to the opening of the Equal Justice Initiative museums a few years ago. And I went as a volunteer, not as a donor. So I sat at tables with people who were from the community in Montgomery and got to hear their stories, got to look at those beautiful museums that are so heartbreaking, but so well done to explain how we went from slavery through Jim Crow, through all these other steps to mass incarceration, the whole progression told through the history of our country. And I'd never seen it told that way. So I wouldn't even say I stepped in or leaned in. I would say I dove in mid-April to start reaching out to people, recognizing that I knew very little, that I didn't have a staff, I didn't have processes, or really even the network I needed. But I've spent more than half of my time, way more than half of my time over the past 3 months, and meeting new people, trying to build allies with people I already know, listening, prioritizing my calendar so that I'm listening to voices of color, that I have access to people, but that I'm not wasting their time. I'm using all these great forums that were already created. So we'll get into a little bit more later about what I'm doing it. I'd say what I'm doing, the amazing thing for me is that this has simultaneously activated my daughters, not me, independently. I have a 23-year-old and a 26-year-old daughter, and they are so activated that I think it was the younger one in early May said, Mom, Dad, and our other daughter, do you guys want to do the Me and White Supremacy 28-day reading and journaling challenge? And I hadn't even heard of it. And so that happened at the same time. And I had the opportunity to really, it's not just listening to stuff, it's not academic, like really looking at the messages that I adopted as a member of this racist culture, looking at the life I created, and that's no longer tolerable to me, that I need to make some significant changes to how I operate in our culture to just be present for it, help in the ways I can, and speak up.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Amy. You know, as I listen to the stories from each of you, it echoes for me. It really does. And I would like to also share where my seeds in that fight for racial equity first got started. Because Amy, you talk about it going on to the next generation and your daughters, and Lauren, you talked about, how it started for you as a child, and it started for me as a child as well. As I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to talk to you guys about and putting this together with my wonderful colleagues, I recalled a memory that I hadn't thought of for a long time, but I'm glad that it came up for me again, because it was a trigger, my very first trigger into looking at racism and knowing just, well, this is not right, this is not okay. And the memory is, I was about 7 years old, and my mom was taking me shopping. Her best friend was getting married, and she had asked me to be a flower girl, and I was super excited to be a flower girl for the first time and wear a poofy princess dress. And my mom was super upset at having to spend $300 on something I'd never wear again. You know, she had to get over that. And we were in a pretty fancy store, and we knew the style of dress we had to pick. And there was a sales associate in the store who very blatantly followed us around the store for a while, always in our line of sight. And then finally she walked up and asked us to leave, you know, and, you know, she was fairly convinced we wouldn't be able to afford anything in the store, which she said out loud. It was the first time I had been referred to, or had heard my mother referred to, as you people. And your kind, and I was 7. So it was also the first time that my mom had to sit me down and explain that that would happen again, that attitude was rampant, and it would manifest itself in different ways, and I needed to be prepared for that. And even though I was a child and could hardly start a social movement right at that moment, I had to wait a few years before I could do that. It was that first seed, that first trigger. And it's not an easy memory to recall, but I think it's important. I think it's important for all of us to remember those triggers, that thing that happened, that story you heard, that incident you saw, that person who touched your life, to recall, to give you energy and to keep your passion going in this fight. Because, you know, as we said before, it's not an easy one to partake. So thank you for sharing with us how your journeys started. And I can already see some questions coming through in the chat. We will get to them. Please keep giving your questions and your comments, or if you, at any point, if you guys want to engage with the panelists directly, just hit the blue hand icon. I'll see it go up, and we'll unmute you so you can have the space to speak and share as well. But I'd like to go ahead and get a little bit more going.
Tarlin, can I just take a moment to just say thank you to you for sharing that story? It's hard to share those stories from when we were kids, and it's gonna make me cry, honestly, because of course I've got a whole bunch to share too. You know, being told to go back where you come from, you don't belong here, sitting on my mom's lap on a bus in Chicago, being chased by kids older than me at my nurseries, at my grade school with my brother. You know, many of us have these stories, right? Whether you grew up Jewish in a place where Jews weren't allowed, or you grew up Asian. You know, I grew up in Kansas City where there were no Asian people, really. We all have so many of these stories. And if I can just take a minute, Tarlin, would you mind dropping that picture of the group picture that I shared with you? I meant to ask for that to be dropped before. And this is a picture, sorry, I'm totally speaking out of turn here.
Okay.
But Tom, thank you for sharing that. Just made me realize I should have shared. This is a picture from our launch. You know, we launched this network in March 2019. And it's like, just look at this picture. I wish I could bottle the vibe and energy and joy of this moment. Some of the people on this call are also in this picture. And, you know, we launched this thing on a hope and a dream, and lots of thinking and lots of talking, but, you know, we got lots of pushback, like, who says a cross-race network can exist? And we're like, well, there's no evidence, but, you know, we need to do it right now, and we're going to do it. So, like, help us out, you know. We launched this thing with joy, power, community as our tagline, and those words that resonate for us even now as we're building this thing a year later. We built this thing intentionally as a cross-race community of individuals of color across the country with means who can come together. And we, at that meeting and continuously, we are thinking and talking about what are the arenas in which we can be powerful together? You know, what are the arenas in which that we can be more powerful together than each of us can be as an individual sum of our parts? And in this room, you know, amazing connections were shared. You know, people shared stories like yours, Tarlin, and we heard from each other cross-race, listening and deeply sharing, like, the pain of these moments in all of our lives, but also trying to balance that with the potential power of what we can do together. So anyways.
There's no need to apologize, Holly. I want you guys to jump in from wherever to keep sharing and reacting. As I said, I encourage this to be a conversation and for this room to have authenticity. So thank you for stopping me, because I wanted to share that picture too. So I'm glad we got the chance to do that. I wanna get into a little bit more about, again, the work that you guys have done and how you've kind of built these pathways for yourself to share some insights with your peers in the room. And Lauren, I would love to start with you. I came across a quote from you in 2014 where you were I actually watched in a YouTube video from the Mara Women Helping Women award recipient video for you. And you said to push forth, we have to see beyond the realm of the boundaries that institutions like to keep everybody within. And this requires breaking rules. Now, I know at this time you were talking about women and issues within that arena, but I did feel compelled to ask, did that translate over as you jumped into racial equity, you know, and if it did, what rules did you break, you know, to push for change in this area? You know, how did others react? You know, what have you learned along the way?
You know, our society and our culture has so many rules and regulations that it chooses to keep us in, wants to keep us in to keep the status quo present and a hold. And as I've been going through this journey, I have found that most of my power has come from stepping out of that mold and not following the rules, regulations, guidelines, behaviors. As a woman, I'm speaking from the South, that is, you know, where I relate to the most, that I felt has held me back so deeply, using my voice, expressing myself, speaking the truth. And I felt that I had to be bold enough and courageous enough and brave enough to step out of that and to speak my truth. This morning in the office, I saw a saying in Diane's office that said, "Speak the truth even if your voice shakes," which was written on a home in New Orleans, I believe, after Katrina. And I feel like that is where we are in this moment. So I understand, as a woman that grew up, that was born in the 50s in a Southern culture, I totally understand to some degree, only to some degree, the pain and the suffering that comes from being held back and being put in a place you can reach your full potential. So as I've moved through this journey, what I have learned from that has related to racial equity and justice is that I have got to be very clear on, and this is a lifelong process, I have got to be very clear on how I've been programmed by my society and my culture around race. So I very beginning in that 2008, 2009 period, very, very intentionally began looking into my implicit biases and deepening my awareness so that I could grow and speak in a more profound way that can potentially help others. And I'll give an example. I was in Indiana for a workshop for about a month, and I was living there. Very small town, very white community. I had already been doing some of this work. And across the street from the house, I saw two young men walking by, one being a Black young man who had a hoodie on and whose pants were lower around the waist. And immediately I had a visceral physical body reaction from this. But because, and like, what is he doing here? But because I had been doing the work, I was able to go, "Ah, there you are. Hi, how you doing? You just popped up your little head, didn't you? Well, so nice to see you. And you know, I'm glad that I recognize you. You can go on about your business now because we're not going to listen to you." My neighborhood I'm in now, people of color, Black, probably not any indigenous, but people of color and Black have been moving in. And I had a visceral reaction immediately when I saw new faces of color walking around my neighborhood. I was able once again to go, ooh, here you are again. Well, nice to see you, because I'm glad you're letting me know this is still inside of me and you can move on down the road again. And that is also the reason why I live in this community. I live in this neighborhood because it is diverse. I live in this neighborhood because I'm around other people, gay people, Black people, you know, people of color, older people. So that's why I live there. So I don't know if I'm fully answering your question, except that for me, it has just been a process of discovery, of listening and learning that this discovery and this exploration is to be done together. And I say these things because I want people, my peers, to understand that we all have this in us. I have this in myself, and I am happy to proclaim it and exclaim it so that I have witness to it, so that I can move through it, and others that maybe have held it back know that it's inside them too, but haven't said anything, are able to say, okay, you know, someone else has this in them too. And to me, that is part of the breaking the rules and the boundaries and the moving forward, because if we do not speak this with truth, even if our voice shakes, we will not get there. We will not get there without speaking the truth and being brave and authentic.
I agree with you 100%. Speaking up matters so much. Even thinking back to that memory in the store, I wasn't just struck by the sales associate being discriminatory. I was also struck by the other shoppers who said nothing, who normalized her behavior by saying nothing, where I could have easily read that as, well, she must be right because no one is stepping in to say this is wrong. So using your voice is critical, even if it's terrifying.
I was going to dive into developing allies, and one of the things I'm really excited about that Lauren, most of the allies I'm developing are through impact investing circles, and I can see this group hasn't, or at least from the poll surveys so far, hasn't been diving into that. That I'm diving in big time and using my voice to make sure that my advisors we're revisiting decisions that they already passed on that were led by people of color. And these are impact investors. These are an impact advisory firm. I mean, these biases and potentials for, you know, decision processes that don't go in the favor of people who've typically been excluded. I think these implicit biases about how communications are happening or what expectations are.
And I hope that in those levers, as we can see, some have already been pulled by the wonderful people joining us here today. And we'll certainly ask what you guys plan to do next. But in keeping true to my word, I would like to turn to some questions from the audience. And one that we got early on that I'd love to present to the panel is, what have been some effective ways to engage your community where most feel that racism is a non-issue? You know, have you been able to communicate the grave importance of recognizing systemic racism within those communities? And I open that to the floor if any of you would like to respond.
Actually, Taryn, could I be annoying again? I actually think the inclusion principles that I shared with you is a really good next segue to what Amy just shared. So can I take 3 minutes and just walk through those? Because I think it's another way to look at a lot of the dynamics that Amy has talked about. And then I cede my time back to the audience. Thank you. Okay, so the Donors of Color Network, and big shout out to Akuna Cook here, who's a brilliant political strategist who developed inclusion principles that we're launching in the political arena. So Donors of Color Network has a C3 for those of you in the US context, and a C4. But I'm sharing here the version that we wrote for a C3 context. And similar to what Amy has put out in her 8 levers, these are guidelines that we think are really useful to share. And we're gonna launch them in, we have lots of ideas for how to launch them in other arenas of work. They're currently in the political arena. So it's really basically about budget equity, Allocate at least 30% of your spending to communities of color and indigenous people or on behalf of communities of color. Hiring equity, think about who is being hired within the organizations that are getting funding up and down the sort of food chain. Like in the political set, we talked about consultants, you know, who are you hiring for on the consultant side? Because as we know in the political world, that's a lot of money. And then, so that's the contract. So working with vendors and consultants who are POC by Black, Indigenous, and POC. And elevate organizational leaders of color, pay attention with especially women of color-led organizations. This is the funding equity. So it's budget equity, hiring equity, funding equity. And then the last piece is almost the most important, like, and then evaluate yourself. And if this is the year that you just have a hard look, kind of like Amy has done for, like intensively for the last 3 months, like take a look at where you are right now. And if 2020 is your baseline year, like you don't have to beat yourself up over it, just track it. And then take a look 6 months from now or 12 months from now and see how you've done with these criteria. If you can think about like applying these criteria onto boards, culture boards, big green environmental justice boards, in addition to the political arena, you can sort of start to imagine the potential power that comes when major donors, including, you know, Amy and Lauren and folks like them who they're influencing, start to walk around armed with sets of simple principles, just like the 8 that Amy shared and that I'm sharing with you here, armed with these principles, and sort of say, like, in exchange for my donation, I would like you to sign on to these principles. And think about the kind of power that we can start to wield and influence how other organizations and donors make their budgeting decisions, their hiring decisions, and their funding decisions.
Well, Ali, that ended up actually being a great answer to the question as well, as far as how to engage people. But I would like to ask that there is this additional focus on the caveat that was presented, which is that who do not believe racism is an issue. You know, you do hear it all the time. Racism hasn't affected my life. It's not on my doorstep. It hasn't happened to people that I care about. Or they really, you know, to put it into context, the very first time I heard that question, I honestly thought, that's a white person question. That's you know, because how could people of color not see that racism is an issue? But then I started coming across plenty of sentiments amongst people of color that are not saying racism isn't an issue, but they focus on this, things are better than before. The colored only signs are gone. I can drink water where I want. I can vote. And racism that's something that happens in the South, you know, half of the US, and I live in New York. Or that's something that happens, you know, gender issues and homophobia and all those rampant things, that's happening elsewhere. It's not happening here. So how do you engage those people? Because we need as many voices at the table as we can get. Racism wasn't built overnight and it wasn't built by one person. So we need everyone as awake as possible to join. So how do you go into those communities and engage those that are like, this fight is not for me?
I actually think Amy or Lauren is better placed to answer this question, but I will make a caveat, a statement, which is, you know, just look at what we're dealing with. I mean, with COVID in the United States, like racism is the factor, you know, that's the underlying condition. That it's a comorbidity, you know, the race of who you are by your race is a comorbidity to how your community and your family and you yourself are experiencing COVID in America, and also now a lot of data coming in European countries as well. But I'll pass that over to Amy or Lauren, I think.
I think what I want to say about that is, I think acknowledging the progress makes us feel better, right? I think in the women's movement as well. So I think there is reality in that and importance in that, to realize where we've come from. But then this is a process, right? This is a life process. So I think having a bit of compassion for where people are in their moment and being able to speak in a way where it can be taken in and the ripple effects can happen. That is why we have chosen to do such a deep investment in art for social change, because we feel like it is a real passion point and place where we can express things in a way that can be, shall we say, better received, and can open up people's minds and awareness more broadly so that they are able to take in information that might be more difficult. So an example for me in our community, Dallas, Texas, is I serve on the board for the Dallas Theater Center, which is a very big regional theater. And they have put a real stake in the ground and taken a real stance on racial equity and justice, being an anti-racist organization flowing throughout that organization. And really the goal within the Dallas Theater Center is to have the care for being an anti-racist organization rise up to the level of the care for the financial statement, shall we say, if we're putting this on the board level. That is the goal. I am co-chair with a Black woman of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee for the Dallas Theater Center, of which we worked with staff at the Theater Center to put forth a statement, EDI statement, that has anti-racist in it, that is a real statement and charge for the organization. And we are moving that forward in ways of opening up to the board and to the community conversations. And we haven't fully fleshed that out. We're in the process of putting that together to how we can have community conversations within this organization to have these discussions, because it is predominantly maybe 75 to 80% white board, and people that are going to come in at very different levels of awareness, of thinking. And so I don't want to say tread lightly at all whatsoever, because kind of back to the speak the truth even if your voice shakes. I mean, I think that's really important in these communities, but I think it's also important to be mindful of the different levels of awareness that people are at and where they enter from. And so the listening being a big aspect of that, even in the white communities, because we don't know everyone's life experience. As you can see that at the foundation, we work at a really relational level, like a deep relational level with our community, and even one-on-one level. And so we really want to get to know people. We want to understand their experiences. We want to be able to have those conversations and share so that we can help move this moment forward, because it is a moment that we have to grasp, we have to take a hold of. People like Amy are coming in here that are really interested in learning more and wanting to, you know, have great results and impact and really move forward in all of these aspects. And I think it is something that we don't want to miss. So I guess what I'm kind of offering up is a combination of the openness, the listening, but still using your voice and speaking the truth in a way that can be received in what other avenue you have. And I think just your access, your networks, your communities, voice up, get people together, you know, talk about these things, and being able to share also in, you know, multiracial ways as well, like Dr. Christopher's work. And I am going to do a little pitch. I hope everybody will also join the racial healing circles, but that is where people from very different life experiences, very different cultures, all races will come together and tell their stories together, which builds the empathy, builds the compassion. Because actually with the self, you know, self-reflection to me is at the core of it all. If we don't get to know ourselves, we don't know where it came from, we don't know why it's instilled in us, I don't feel we can move forward for real paradigm change that we are really wanting to happen. And I think we have to take a deep look at ourselves as far as our behaviors, our life experiences, our money levels, you know, how much is enough, all of that sort of thing. I think all of that needs to be involved in this conversation, because if we as white people who have most of the wealth, if we continue to hold on to this level of wealth and don't really look at what is enough and what we really need to be putting out in the world like Amy is doing, we will not get there either, because we cannot hoard all this money as white people. And I will call it hoarding. I do have to be brave and bold, and I do call it hoarding.
You're amazing, Lauren. I just think there's so much wisdom in what you just said. You know, there's moments when you have to like hold hands and like to someone in your life and you meet them where they're at and you're like, come on, come with me. Let's go on this journey together. I'll be there with you. It's going to be hard. There's other times where you kind of have to say, you know what, there's this great resource over there that those guys are doing. It's not my job to do that right now with you, but here's my friend Lauren, and have a look with Women Moving Millions and Synergos and all this other stuff that's out there, right? And at Donors of Color, like we're really finding one of the things that we can do is be a bridge. You know, we can connect people. Like Amy and her team called me we had a long conversation and I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to connect you directly through Ashindi, the brilliant co-director of Donors of Color Network, through Ashindi directly to the Movement for Black Lives resource table, because we don't have to be in the middle of that relationship. If you don't know those folks, we do, so we can connect you, you know, and that's something that we can do just to get more money out the door to movements and resources, movements on the ground that need these resources. There's so much in what you shared, Lauren, and so a lot of it I think is like, for sure, deep reflection. Our team at Donors of Color and our board is all people of color, and our team is all women of color, but there are race dynamics even within our little team. You know, we have to have these conversations, I mean, internally, just like everyone else does in this moment in time, especially. So, you know, reflection for sure. And it reminds me of like old school feminism, you know, like first wave feminism in a way, like the personal is political, and what, like unpacking all of what that means. And Lauren, you've been so powerful sharing your story on lots of different stages that I've seen. And it's such an important thing you can do. And Amy, you as well, as, you know, women, white women with wealth, moving and influencing your peers along and thinking about the influence that we can have in all of our circles to move our circles and peers and networks along.
I'd like to, I'm glad that you brought up that both you and Lauren brought up something that really struck with me, which is power. It's certainly a topic that I see a lot of people tiptoe around. And Lauren, I think what you said was very powerful about hoarding wealth, which in a sense is hoarding power, and having that shift in power and being able to share power. It's not always the easiest thing to ask people to do. And I do want to ask that question, not just to you, but Amy, I would love to, because I know that you've dug into this as well, or you've likely come across it as well. But I would love to know, you know, if those conversations do arise, you know, what does that balance really look like? Because what you said was powerful, Lauren, and I can easily see people getting freaked out by that passion. Lord knows we've all been labeled at one point or another. But what does that balance look like to be able to, you know, yes, do for yourself. It's human. We want to take care of ourselves and our family and make sure our legacy is passed down to our children. But how do you hold that balance in sharing power? And even though it's not an easy conversation to broach, and not just within the U.S., you know, we got a question from an audience member from Colombia, or said she's from Colombia, and said that we are a highly unequal society, and wanted to know why the problem in the U.S. is focused on race or skin color and not inequality, when inequality happens in so many places. And I think a lot of that does have to do with power, these systems that, you know, make things exclusive to benefit the powerful and leave out everyone else. So I would love to know what that balance looks like and why, you know, and if you could address the audience members' question as well.
Well, I'll speak and just say, I mean, the inequities are at the core of it all. And I think for us, or for me, shall I say, here in America, it lands with actually the Black-white paradigm, indigenous, because of how wealth was built in this country. And I know slavery's been around a long time and it happened in many different countries. So I want to acknowledge that. My base and, you know, my presence is here. I guess I'm just full of stories today, but I feel like this one is relevant along the sharing power lines. A few years back, in December, I was at a Movement for Black Lives funder briefing. And this was early on in the Black Lives Matters movement. And I had a huge other aha moment, which was, it is Black women's time to lead. These women were so incredible. their strategy, their energy, their charisma, their speech, you know, kind of back to that statement where, you know, white women only have to know basic math, or white people, whereas black people need to know calculus, you know, just to get through in the world. So that's what I felt like I was dealing with. You know, I'm basic math and they were calculus. So then I had to delve into knowing that that was the time. It's not my time. Like, where do I take that? Because that's totally about sharing power. And being a woman from the South, born in the time period I spoke of, I kind of almost had just found my power. I'd been fighting for my power. I'd been fighting for my voice to be heard. I'd almost come to like fully fleshed into that. And now that I see this aha moment, like, what do I do? You know, where is my place? And I think that is a moment of where we truly and completely are right now, as people are figuring out where their place is. And I was able and fortunate enough to have a discussion at the Women Moving Millions Summit with Vanessa Daniels, who runs an organization in Seattle, to talk about that, Black woman, white woman, to really talk about that. And really for me to express that it was making me fearful and a little bit upset. You know, like how I was dealing with my emotions around this wielding of power that I feel like I'd just fully grown into. And so I think I guess my main point around that is, once more and once again, a critical look at, if we truly say we want a different world, we really want a more equitable world, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for me? What do I need to wield? What do I need to help build? You know, how can I share the power, still keep my voice in it, but support? Knowing that I've had such advantages throughout this life that it is almost a responsibility of mine at this point to still be there, but set back a little bit. So that's just what I want to bring out. And it's a very scary, emotional thing to have to think about losing that. It really is, because if we really want to shift, we have elitisms, we have powers, we have things that come our way, not necessarily by virtue of anything that we've done in some instances. So we really need to grapple with that. We really need to grapple with that and dig deep into it.
I would jump in also. There's been so many great things said. I love the conversation about the racial healing circles, which obviously wouldn't address the people who, we probably will have a long time before we can get people in the room who don't even think racism is an issue. But I guess to jump in on the power conversation, one of the things that's emerging for me after this 3 months of scurrying around like a little like animal, I don't know, that's what it feels like I'm just scurrying around, gathering acorns, bringing them back, not quite sure what's happening and what I'm going to do with all that, but taking action to some degree as I go. I'm starting to form an opinion that, for me, a great place to play on the power imbalances is to get more engaged again, like Lauren was talking about place-based stuff. So since I live in Boston, Massachusetts area, there's some wonderful organizations that are involved in solidarity economy stuff and really shifting the power of, you know, just because I'm the one with resources, why do I also get the most vote? You know, so their Boston Ujima project, creating a new way of giving participants, can be investors. It's an impact investing fund where they're raising capital of all kinds from different types of people to then invest in local businesses. And what I love about it, and I don't know much about it yet, but this is a little bit where my energy is going right now after, you know, in this week, is really understanding more about how do we shift power to people in the communities who can be making better decisions about where proximal leaders, getting access to capital, access to decision making, getting votes. Why do the people with the most money get the most votes in deciding where capital goes? So whether that's a nonprofit model, which there are many nonprofit models of participatory grant making, I'm advocating for that in a new fund that is being launched by several funders on the African continent, that we're moving more toward participatory grant making. And then in impact investing, like, I'm super fired up about these models where people are gonna, the people who are gonna either lead the organization, so there's a little conflict of interest, but there's ways of getting around that. Like, why not give more voice? We give the money, and then we trust the local proximal leadership, new committees, new ways of forming, to make the decisions of which businesses in that area or which nonprofits can do more with that, better with that those funds. And then we can free up money, no offense to staff members on the call, but maybe we could shift a little bit of money from the staff we've had doing all that work. I'm my own staff, sort of, except in Africa, I'm not, but then we can free up more money to give away even more money. So I can't, so I don't know even about it yet, but if anyone on the calls is really thinking about place-based, participatory, solidarity economy, that world, I'm super excited to learn more and partner more with more of you doing that work.
Amy, I don't know if you can see what I saw, but I saw a lot of people going like, yes, yes, yes. So
and the little tapping.
Yeah, I think you'll definitely probably get some outreach, and we will be sharing Amy's contact after the session if you guys want to reach out and potentially collaborate and exchange feedback. I know she's very open to that. I want to take a moment, and I see the comments and the questions. I'm so glad you guys are conversing within the chat. Please know that you are free to raise your hand, to be unmuted, to share directly with the panelists as well. I am keeping an eye out for that. I'd actually like to try something a little different than we normally do. And I do have another question, but I'd like to pose it to the entire room. And you can, again, give your answers in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll happily unmute you so that you can speak. And this is almost a bit of a personal situation for me as well. I have seen unfold and plenty of times, and I'm sure many of you in the room have seen it also, organizations and social movements led by people of color consistently face criticism about their methods for enacting change. You know, they're called too radical, too political, and this causes a lot of impact investors, philanthropists, and other organizations to shy away from partnering up. So as a philanthropist or a grant maker or an impact investor, if you're committed to structural change, how do you prioritize long-term measurements and investments into these communities that are at the forefront? You know, what insights would you share with this room who may be shying away because of those labels of being too political or too radical? I would almost say that radical is not necessarily a bad thing, because this system runs deep, as we've all said. So radical change, I believe, is certainly needed, but those labels can be pretty damaging. So what advice, what insights would you guys give in the room? Panelists, of course, you're free to answer that question as well. Holly, I would actually ask if you could share first on that, because with the Donors of Color Network, I can imagine, you know, if they want to lift up the communities that they may come from and lift up those people that are at the forefront who need a voice at the table, you know, it can, you know, how do they handle those that may shy away because it's like, oh, this is too loud or too crazy for me?
Yeah, I'll hop in. I want to say something about the power thing real quick too. I remember long ago, our board co-chair, Jeannie Park, I don't know if she's on the call or not, she said something really funny, but really smart. She said, if we're not going to talk about systems and power, then what is the point of us? What is the point of us? Like, what is the point of the work we're doing if we're not going to try to change fundamentally the systems that have not served our communities in America? Like, I'm talking in the US, in a US context, our communities of color, poor people, immigrant communities, indigenous communities for sure. Systems haven't served us. So if we're going to come together as a network, first time ever network, we think it's historic, we think it's awesome, and we're trying to have fun with it too. If we're going to come together as a community of individuals of color with means and access to means and networks and resources to bring to bear, if we're not going to talk about systems and changing systems and power, what is the point of us? And I think that all of us in this room who are connected to resources or who are well resourced, we should be asking ourselves that, you know, whether it's our neighborhood or our churches, our schools, our alumni networks, our the wealth that we inherited, whatever it is, how can we use those to build systems that are more equitable and fair for the people in our communities? In terms of grant making, you know, Urvashi Vad, Ashindi, Max and I are sort of the co-founders of this thing. We all come from different places in the philanthropic sector. And through many years of doing this work, I think we've all landed on some things that we agree about. You know, one is like, don't make it too hard. Like, invest in leaders and organizations that are doing really good work on the ground. Don't ask them to give you like 10 years of taxes and a metrics model of success. I mean, these are all like, sorry, Amy, it's McKinsey level like scrutiny that isn't really appropriate for this kind of like world-changing visionary sector, you know? Can we find the next Rashad Robinson, the next Ai-jen Poo, the next Marissa Franco from Mi Gente 10 years ago and just fund them? Like, even if they don't have like a super well thought out plan and 20 years of proven success, like 20 years of proven success haven't done a lot in climate and racial equity and racial justice and wealth inequality in our country. Like, why do we want to fund the groups that have 20 years of success when it really honestly hasn't been that successful? Like, wouldn't it be better, more fun, more hopeful, more promising, more optimistic, more future oriented if we can find the Rashads and the Ai-jens and the Marissas now and fund them? And sure, we'll make some mistakes, but you know what? Their deputy is going to be awesome, or someone on their board, or someone who advises them. Like, that, if we can trust the leadership and the communities who are in it, and, you know, to use your words, Amy, proximate, then we will have better results. And we have evidence that the other way doesn't work. So this year, we're building a lot of systems at Donors of Color Network and Donors of Color Action with under Ashindi's leadership. She, co-director of the network, I don't know if she's on or not, but she's great. First foray into grant making. And the criteria, like sort of the scoring sheet for evaluating proposals. And again, you know, it's a sort of a trial this year because we're not moving tons of money, but we're building a system to hopefully move more money soon. It's like a 2-page criteria, you know, and it was a letter of intent. Like, the application process is simple. We're using the Just Fund amalgamated portal. It doesn't ask for a lot. Like, keep it pared down. These are change makers, you know, visionary people. We don't want to burden them with a 20-page narrative, 14 pages of some sort of metrics and a freaking tax return. Like, it's just too much to ask them to do. I will get off my high horse now. Thank you, Tarlin.
Well, I'll kind of join your high horse because I agree with all of that. And I have to admit, for those on the call, I don't know, but I will also put out there that we are not a measurement metrics foundation. We love to find the new and the happening on the ground, but not necessarily through our eyes. We like going into the communities and saying, who's rocking it in this community right now? You all know, we don't know. You know who's rocking it in these communities. And to find out that way and to support these new and upcoming organizations with fantastic and amazing leaders. I also just wanted to add a couple of things that I think what you brought forth, Tarn, was really the breaking the rules, the radically. You know, all this is really the stepping out and the breaking the rules. But it also is implicit belief systems at work as well, too, because we all know that the organizations of color have to go through a lot more strain to prove themselves to white funders than any of the white organizations do. And really, it's not necessarily a conscious thing. To some place, it is an unconscious thing. So what I would put forth is just be clear about that, have some awareness around that as a funder, as an organization, be aware and look for any little points or any little red flags as to where you might be doing that you might be questioning that leader of color more, you might be asking them for more data, you might be asking them more questions, and really correlate with yourself. Would I be asking these questions? Would I be asking for this of a white-led organization? And see what you find out, because I think a lot of it is implicit. And thank you for goals too out there.
Thank you for pointing that out, Lawrence. I certainly do agree with you. And I'd actually like to hit on something you just said about stepping into these communities and finding what's new, like who are the hot leaders in here, what can we do for them? And I would actually like to ask a question to Amy around kind of connecting the two of us for a moment, because there's this quote from Nelson Mandela that says, "Young people are capable, when aroused, of bringing down the towers of oppression and raising the banners of freedom." And if you look at young people from any era, you'll find impressive catalysts for change, from 7th grader Gwendolyn Sanders in the 1963 Birmingham Civil Rights Campaign to Michaela Shell Dominguez in the indigenous water rights movements, to student-led movements in Brazil during World War II. You know, young people are informed and involved more than ever, and they are what's hot and what's happening, and that energy and that passion that they bring. And I know that you've done a lot of working with young people through the SISI Fund. So my question for you and for the other panelists as well is, how could I, a young, well, relatively young, a young, African immigrant from an unprivileged background, partner with a network such as yours to reinforce that push for systemic change? Where do you feel youth mobilization is, where is that youthful voice most required?
Thank you. Ooh, a stumper for me, because I haven't really connected the work I'm doing right now with the work I've been historically doing. I think that I'm starting to believe, at least in my work in Africa, that I see there's just an abundance of programs being delivered to youth with the hopes that it's what they want and it's what they need and that they'll take it up. And so I'm far more and that unfortunately doesn't always happen, because they have no way of differentiating which of these programs are actually going to lead to impact in their lives. So unfortunately, it leads to a lot of fragmentation, and I'd say increased hopelessness, because they're like, yay, I signed up for that entrepreneurship camp, and then I got a lunch and maybe a t-shirt, but I still didn't get to increase my income or my dignity. So I would say what I'm excited about personally on the African continent is something called shoe jazz, which is Sheng street language, Swahili street language for heroes, where they're actually, instead of not just, because all these programs we run are so great and they're so well-meaning, they're somehow flipping the agency factor. They're flipping, getting youth to see possibilities for how they can step up to, even though there are terrible injustices everywhere in the world, but how they can step up and show up in a new way, that maybe with a new optimism and a new hope. So then they may actually be the one person from their community who more successfully starts a poultry business that actually works. They may be the one who actually, starts using birth control so that they control their family planning. So there's something about agency that I haven't really explored fully, but the results from Shoe Jazz, who started in Kenya 10 years ago and now has 7.5 million youth on their platforms of comic books, radio programs, and they're seeing real impact across all of these elements of the youth lives, that they're starting voting, they're more likely to start a small business that succeeds. So I don't know how to link that back here yet, but I think there's something about agency, that we're not gonna fix all these systemic things overnight, unfortunately, as hard as we're all gonna work. And how do we help youth develop real agency so they are really feeling more self-directed to and empowered to take advantage of some of these opportunities that might be in front of them.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Amy. And I hope as you start to unfold how to make that connection, that I'm one of the calls you make, because I would love to certainly get involved. And I notice now that, again, such amazing questions have come through, such great comments. I also see connections being made in the chat. I'm so happy to see that. The one thing that I think this space needs, amongst all the others, and I think each panelist touched on it today, is authentic relationships and connections, because this space is not easy. It's not the space for short-term answers. It's not the space for a savior mentality. It's not the space for a victim mentality. It's a space where people can learn to bridge and build trust and move from empathy to compassion and really listen to each other's stories and humanize each other, so that we know that this is a common goal for each of us. With that being said, I do want to respect the time that you've all put in, because we've heard a lot, we've discussed a lot. I'd like to give the floor to each of the panelists to, give some final advice on how to start putting that racial justice lens on philanthropic efforts, any calls to action you might have. I know each of you are interested in collaborating, and I've seen that in the chat as well. I would love if you have anything final to say to our audience today. And Lauren, if I could give the floor to you to start.
I don't know that I have anything to add as outside of what I've already mentioned. But what I do want to say is what we have found to be of ultimate importance in building our relationships and in working deeply in the community is the listening, deep listening, and honing those skills, and being committed, being deeply committed to the work and putting the dollars in that are required, and the longevity of the piece. Early on, we had a little pushback, and it was because, well, white people come in and they want to help out, and then it gets a little too difficult and they leave. So a real stance, a real stake in the ground saying, I am in this work, I am in it for the long haul, I am with you, I will not leave you. I am here to help you in whatever way and best way possible that I am able to do so. We need more funding in this space. Oh, you all I'm just an appeal for the funding in this space. And I know it's happening. Early on in our days, we were the only one, almost really the only one in our community. You just can't do it yourself. So I know that's happening, but just a real direct appeal for money in this space. And then I want to in case people don't know, kind of that revolutionary love, that movement that's going on now. I think Valerie Quar started it through her book, and I think she's amazing. So I would recommend that book, but I'd say self-care. Let's help these young people take care of themselves, not burn out. All of that I think is really, really important right now in this work, to make sure that people know they have the support and are able to stay in it. And I just deep, deep gratitude to everyone on this call, to Amy, to Holly, to Tarlin, everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the bottom of my heart for listening and for being engaged and caring in this work. It's a real moment, and I know we can do it. I know we can do it together. Thank you.
Holly?
Sorry, muted. This is the first time I've been part of the Synergos community, and it's been really fun. And I wish I could talk with each of you individually, and I wish I could have been more engaged in the chat, because I just think that we would find lots of connections and co-working possibilities. Thank you to Kate for inviting me to be part of this thing. Hi, Tarlin, thank you, and a pleasure to share the stage with you and with Lauren and Amy. So I just wanted three things. There are so many burning fires in the world right now. Like, pick one and give. Like, get it out the door. Like, give, like how Lauren sort of said, like, talk until your voice trembles, or if it's hard and your voice trembles, talk anyway. So I forget how you said it much better than that. But like, give till you sweat a little bit, especially in the American context, to Indigenous communities, movement for Black lives, in this moment of uprisings and in our COVID moment. And also use your influence, use the 8, whether it's Amy's 8 index of 8 levers, or our inclusion principles, or write your own. Use your influence to move your peers along the same journey. That's the short term. In the middle term, think about systems change. We're at Donors of Color and Donors of Color Action. We are really focusing everything we do to build power in communities of color in 6 states. If you guys want to talk about our strategy, I'd be very happy to talk with any of you guys about that. Don't be afraid of the political arena, because in the American context, like, we have to be involved in the political arena if we care about shifting systems and power to be more responsive to communities of color, immigrant communities, Black and Indigenous people. And then third, long-term, join with us. Imagine a future in which we are all free. Imagine a future in which Black people, Indigenous people are free, and therefore all of us are free. In this work at Donors of Color Network, we are trying to, thinking about working and trying to work with culture and narrative change makers who are reaching audiences of millions, tens of millions, to get stories out there that are more reflective of our experiences. Culture and narrative change has to be part of the conversation if we're talking about changing our culture fundamentally from the bottom up. So short-term, move money till you sweat right now to the thing that you care about, whether it's climate or race or neighborhood or wealth inequality. Middle term, systems change, politics, power to communities of color. Third, longer term orientation, imagine a future in which we are all free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. Amy?
It's rare, but I feel speechless. I think everyone has the opportunity to find what gives you energy in this work. And I think that's what I'm discovering. And it feels like a really different approach than maybe how I've done things before, where I've felt, like, as I mentioned before, that I had all these analytical mindsets and, like there's some right answer. And for now, I would say, like, this is giving me so much energy to work with, to find all these new allies like all of you and all these great resources who've been sharing here. And then it's drinking from a hot fire hose. So you really need to be a little bit selective about which of all those opportunities we're going to go down. But I will say my eighth lever and Holly's intermediate is we all have to get more politically active than maybe we like to, and donate to campaigns, even though it makes me not want to sweat. It makes me kind of want to barf because it's, paying for advertisements that are disgusting to me. But I think I need to just swallow that and just do it, because we need to get more people of color in office. We need to get people who are going to really lean into unraveling the systemic racism in our country.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Oh, and thanks, Marlene, for inviting me. I see she just posted. Thanks, Marlene. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marlene, and thank you, Kaden, and anyone who helped make the connections that made this panel possible. And please let me say to the group, Synergos is here to help make these connections for you. We're gonna share contacts for the panelists, but also happy to make connections between these members in the group as well. We don't want this conversation to end here. We, as I said in the very beginning of the meeting, we plan to hold multiple spaces for us to continue being brave with each other, continue having these conversations, sharing our stories, and using this time, this momentum to bring real systemic change that is to the benefit of all of us. I am blown away by what was shared in this meeting. I cannot thank Holly, Amy, and Lauren enough. I knew I would be impressed with you, but I went so far beyond what I thought. So thank you for the stories you shared, the insights you gave. Thank you so much to each of the participants for the links you shared, the comments, the questions within the chat. I know we didn't get to everything. It's not possible to get to everything, but I hope that the next invitation you see, you'll come back. You'll continue this journey with us. You'll continue sharing with us, continue growing with us, and keep letting us know what you need from us as well. We certainly want to make sure that we're co-creating these spaces with you. So as you can see, we'll be sharing the video recording of this event by mail. And we do have a part 3 in this series launch. Lauren mentioned earlier Dr. Christopher's Healing Circles. We will be doing a virtual version of that on August 13th. It'll be facilitated, and it's a deep dyad. So you got to come strong, you got to come open, you got to come brave. I hope to see many of you there. We'll send out an invitation to each of you to sign up if you have the availability to do so. Again, thank you so much for how open and amazing you all were. Cannot wait to see you again. Reach out if you want to make connections with us on our Instagram, our Facebook, our Twitter, and we'll connect you to, to anywhere where your journey can take you on the next step. I wish you all a good afternoon or evening or rest of the day. Be blessed, stay safe.